I'm Dom Nichols, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we hear from our reporter in Kyiv about the latest air attack on Ukraine, which, according to authorities in the city, saw 6 so-called unstoppable hypersonic missiles and all other incoming munitions and drones shot down.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
We need a military strategy for Ukraine to gain a decisive advantage on the battlefield, to win the war.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Tuesday, the 16th of May, 1 year and 81 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by foreign reporter Meghna Nanu and, live from Kyiv, one of the Telegraph's photojournalists, Heathcliff O'Malley. I started by going through the latest news from Ukraine. I will start with the news of those air raids last night. So Ukraine says it shot down 6 unstoppable, that's the word that Russia gave to these missiles, unstoppable hypersonic missiles overnight after one of the most intense air raids on the capital in recent history, the 8th air raid this month. So Yuri Inyat, who's Ukraine's Air Force spokesman, said Kyiv was targeted with 6 Kinzhal missiles launched from MiG-31K aircraft. There were 9 cruise missiles fired from ships in the Black Sea and 3 land-based S-400 cruise missiles also targeted the capital. So Mr. Inyat said 18 missiles of various types were intercepted and shot down. There were some drones as well. He said it was exceptional in its density, the maximum number of attack missiles in the shortest period of time. Oh, sorry, that was Sergei Popko, the head of Kyiv's military administration. That was on Telegram. But Defence Minister Alexei Reznikov, he's been speaking this morning on Twitter. He said another unbelievable success for the Ukrainian Air Forces. Last night, our Sky Defenders shot down 6 Russian hypersonic Kinzhal missiles and 12 other missiles. And later on this morning, the Ukrainian MOD said that all targets were shot down. So what we think happened, what we think was launched, we think there were 6 Kinzhal, so the hypersonic missiles, like I say, Russia said they were unstoppable. 9 Caliber cruise missiles, 6 Shahed 136 drones. These are the Iranian-supplied kamikaze drones, but people don't like the term kamikaze, but one-way attack drones sounds a bit clunky. And 3 S-400 ballistic missiles, as well as some other reconnaissance drones, the Orlan-10 being amongst them. Now, Ukrainian officials reported that debris fell across the city, as you'd expect from these things being hit in the sky. 3 people so far reported injured, no deaths reported yet. Kyiv Mayor Vitaly Klitschko said falling debris had hit several cars, set a lot on fire, damaged a building in the west of the capital, and at the same time, air defence systems also hit drones, which I think probably come from the total number, but a drone attack south of Borispil. So this is basically a suburb, or it's a separate town, but it's 5 k's southeast of Kyiv itself. Now, Russia claims that it destroyed a Ukrainian Patriot air defence system using one of the Kinzhal missiles, and on social media, you'll see it on our website and it'll be elsewhere as well. There are certainly images of an explosion at ground level, but it's a photograph. Heathcliff will be able to help us out here. But so, I can't tell if it's the launch of a missile, the sort of bloom, that brief bloom you get from the missile blasting off, or if it's something landing there and destroying everything. So that's not clear, but it is at odds with the Ukrainian MOD statement saying that everything was shot down. They're unlikely to have said that if there's news coming out later of, oh no, we've had one of our air defence batteries destroyed. But also you should bear in mind that each battery, and I think Ukraine have 3 at the moment, they've been promised more, but I think they've got 3 in the country at the moment. But each battery, which consists of a radar, a control station and the actual launch tubes, they're all separated. They're spread out just so that they can withstand an attack. You don't want everything to be in one site so that it can be destroyed. So they will be spread out. So even if this is a blast on the Patriot, we don't know if it's the launch site, the radar, or the control station. But I have to say, I kind of doubt Russia's version there because I doubt everything they say, basically. But that's the news as we've got it. Heathcliff, you're joining us live from Kyiv. Be very interested to hear your thoughts. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
You were with Roland last week down in the Donbass region. You're back now in Kyiv for a little time. We won't talk about dates when you're coming out and all the rest of it, but be fascinated to hear your thoughts last night. What did you hear and what's the mood in the city this morning?
Last night, we all have these apps here on our phones which tell us when there's an air raid. My phone has the habit of switching the volume off on its own, and so instead I got woken up by the explosions, and I've never heard anything like it really. With artillery it's different, but it was a very noisy night and the hotel shook. I heard over a dozen explosions, but you couldn't see. When I looked out of the window, first of all, to see what was going on, I could see what looked like flares falling, but I think those might have been the debris from the rockets. But you have to be careful in terms of pictures here, because people have become unstuck before where they've taken a picture. You don't want to give away the location of the air defence, so you do have to be careful at the same time. But what I saw last night didn't really make a picture. There was lots of smoke drifting around afterwards from the launches of the air defence. But yeah, it was a little bit scary. It wasn't terrifying, but it was a little bit scary. It's a big city. You'd have to be very unlucky. Sadly, last night it does sound like 3 people are injured. I think debris fell on the zoo. I saw some pictures of some buses that were destroyed, and I saw this video of the alleged drone of the alleged Patriot strike, but it's very difficult to know. At the end of the video, it looked like there could have been some sort of secondary explosions of stuff sort of fanning out in different directions, but it's very difficult to say, and I just can't imagine the Ukrainians would confirm or deny whether that did happen. And even if it did, the Patriots have done an incredible job as of late in defending the city, and sometimes things do get destroyed and lost. So if it is true, then that it happens. But let's fingers crossed it didn't.
Yeah, we've made that point a number of times on the pod that is what happens in war, and the more stuff that is gifted and sent to Ukraine, these things are going to turn up. We've seen images of British and American armoured vehicles that have been destroyed. We need to get used to this. This is going to happen. We're going to see some of our amazing tanks and all the rest of it. This is what happens when you fling heavy metal around the place. So we shouldn't worry about that. They're expensive. We should worry about the people operating them. But this is going to happen. What's the mood in the city this morning, Heathcliff? Have people gone back to work? Any more air raid sirens since?
No, well, there was a second air raid siren, which meant I had to stay up later than planned. I thought, I can get back to bed now at about 4:30, and then the alarm went off again almost immediately. So, but then this morning, everyone's back to normal. The people of Kiev they've learnt to live with it. I was talking to some people this morning and chatting about it, and they were just talking about how frightening it is. They just have to get on with life, and you learn pretty quickly that you've got to get some sleep and deal with it and carry on. And yesterday I was out walking about, and people are enjoying the sunshine. It's been blazingly hot here and sunny. Today it's very overcast, but still incredibly warm, and it's just incredible. When you're out, I was having dinner with people the other night, and just to think, 14 months ago, it looked like Kiev was going to be taken possibly by the advancing Russian forces. And you look now, and when you look at the situation in the capital, and it's just so clear that Russia has failed. It's still a long way to go. They can't be underestimated. They're not stupid. But I think as far as their special operation is concerned, it has failed. It's just a matter of when now they decide to accept that fact.
Thanks, Heathcliff. Now, whilst you're on, we chatted to you briefly last week, but don't often get to speak to your band of brothers, the photographers, and I'd be really interested to get your perspective on this and the reporting of wars such as this. Do you feel safer where you are now in Kyiv, or when you were in the Donbass. I'm just thinking that when I was in the military, I much preferred being when I was in charge of my destiny to a certain degree, as opposed to being elsewhere and relying on others. It's just, what's your perspective? You've been out in the Donbass for quite a while, and then you come back to Kyiv, try to get a night's sleep, and 18 missiles turn up.
Yeah, it's really quite strange, because before the Donbass we were down in Kherson, which was liberated in November, and I was there for the liberation, and the mood was very jubilant at the beginning, and now it's an incredibly dangerous place. And in fact, I would say down in Kherson is probably the most dangerous place I've been. When Roland and I were in the Donbass and up on the front, it's the front, but it's close to where the artillery were positioned, because we were of an air defence team that basically protect the artillery from threats from the air, like drones and MiGs and stuff. And even though it was incredibly noisy and there was all sorts of artillery going off in both directions, I would say that being in a city like Kherson is actually more dangerous, because what I've learnt the hard way is from the trips that we've been having is that there is just no warning with artillery. You've literally got a half-second whistle and a boom, and you don't even have the time to take cover. So you can imagine being a Ukrainian civilian who needs to go to the shops or go to maybe take some supplies round to their grandmother. There's a lot of elderly people here who can't look after themselves, and they need people to help them. I mean, those are the people that get caught in the crossfire, because the Russians seem to spend a lot of time trying to make the civilians' lives as miserable as possible. And yeah, so I'd say, in fact, the most dangerous place I've felt was being in Kherson more than anywhere. But it is bizarre to come back to Kiev, and one minute you're promenading and enjoying the sunshine, and then that night you're being rocketed with a hell of a lot of ordnance. So, yeah, it was quite difficult to get your head around, really. But humans are adaptable, and that's what the Ukrainians have done. It's incredible.
Yeah, and I hear what you're saying about people are nervous and frightened. I mean, these are all appropriate human reactions. I'd be more worried if they weren't, to be perfectly honest. The same goes for you guys and us when we're out there. I mean, these are what you need. This is part of the human defense mechanism. I mean, when you are operating there, you have your face pressed up against the lens, the other bit. What's the other bit? The viewfinder? It's all very technical. I don't really understand these things. But I mean, do you ever feel detached from it? And does that make it easier to look at these things, or do you feel as if you haven't got that sort of situational awareness because you're not looking around? You're literally looking through all the gizmos and all those funny little bits you keep twiddling.
I think, forgive the pun, but in a way it helps you focus. Because when you're busy doing something, it's like I remember years ago photographing at the end of the Vendée Globe boat race, and I was terribly seasick beforehand, but as soon as I knew what I was doing and taking pictures, I lost it. And I think it's the same when you're working somewhere like here. When you're shooting, when you're working with the camera, you're able to focus like you would be if you were reporting, and you don't start thinking about other stuff. And I think that helps. I don't think it detaches you in the same way, but for instance, I was photographing some funerals, and I think it was actually tougher when I was editing the pictures afterwards, because it's brought it back, the anguish and the grief and everything. But I think, the using the camera just it does focus the mind, but I've never felt at risk when I've been taking pictures. I don't feel like I lose that sort of proof. It's not like using night vision goggles when you lose complete spatial awareness and stuff like that. It's because you're only looking through with one eye. You've always got, I think it's I can't remember, is it my left eye or my right eye? I think it depends on the mood I'm in, but you've always got one eye free to have a look around you.
Yeah, and just finally, I'll come back to you at the end. I'll be for any final observations, anything that happens over the next half hour or so. But I mean, to those that say, well, why do we still need photojournalists? There's helmet cam on all the soldiers. We can see what's going on the front line. We've got CCTV all over the cities, so we can kind of see what's going on. What is the power of the image? Why do you still do it?
I just think photography in general is incredibly important, and it's a proven piece of record of an event. And often stills images will linger in the mind far longer than words. And sometimes they become iconic for either the right or wrong reasons. I don't even know if that's the right word, but Everybody has photographs that stick in their mind, and all of these extra pictures we see now taking on people's mobile phones and GoPros are all valuable as well. They sort of help to build that picture up. It's almost like a jigsaw puzzle, but you need independent, objective journalists on the ground writing and taking pictures to record what's going on. And I do think they have a tremendous impact, and often there are times when I shoot a picture that somebody has to write words around, and and other times I have to illustrate somebody's words, but their pictures do still have a lot of power. And I think in the digital age, people are looking at screens more and more, and pictures are still as important as they ever were, really.
Lovely. Thanks, mate. I'll pop back to you at the end. But for now, if I may, let's turn to Maina. Maina, you've been looking at some of the international scene, some of the stories on the diplomatic front. What have you been looking at?
Yeah, so today we've had the news that Olena Zelenska, who's obviously Ukraine's first lady, met the South Korean president in Seoul today. And she said that she was seeking more radical backing for Ukraine in its fight against Russia. Now, this is quite interesting because South Korea, as we know, is the world's 9th largest arms exporter, and it's sold tanks and howitzers to Poland. But it does have a long-standing policy of not providing weapons to active conflict zones. But she was quite favourable in her remarks to a news agency when she was asked if Ukraine planned to invite the South Korean president to Kyiv. And she said that Ukraine was always waiting for its friends. So that's one to watch out for.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, South Korea, they've just sold 900 odd tanks to Poland. I mean, a big old delivery. It really shows the defence industrial base in South Korea, and also the heft, the security heft of Poland. There is it's a subject for another day probably, but I do feel the centre of gravity of kind of hard power in Europe, if you take away the United States for a start, but the hard power in NATO shifting east towards Poland and Baltic, Nordic states. Anyway, that's me musing. We will chat again. What else, Megan? Are you looking elsewhere? Were you a couple of other stories?
Yeah, so, speaking about Poland, China's special Ukraine envoy is going to visit Poland. It's going to visit Warsaw on Friday, and that's following a 2-day trip to Kyiv. So I think they're currently in Ukraine. But just generally, that's quite interesting because China has said that the aim of this tour, which is seeing it visit Ukraine, Poland, and are they also visiting somewhere else in Europe, I think? And they said the aim of the tour is to communicate with all parties on the political settlement of the Ukrainian crisis. So that's just quite interesting because obviously Zelensky previously had a phone call with Xi Jinping towards the end of April. So it's just an interesting one to watch out for.
Yeah, it has somewhat gone quiet on the China front just lately. And I wonder if they are keeping their diplomatic powder dry, just seeing what's going to happen with the much anticipated spring offensive and if it's going to do anything and if it brings about the end of the war. But they've tried to set themselves up as the broker. But so the last few weeks, not an awful lot has been going on there. Like I say, I think they're probably waiting to see. Is that it, mate? Anything else from you, or should I move on?
There's just one final update from South Africa. So Cyril Ramaphosa, who's the South African president, he said that a group of 6 African leaders are planning to travel to Russia and Ukraine as soon as possible to help find a resolution to the devastating conflict between the two countries. And he said that he's spoken to both Putin and Zelensky, and they've agreed to receive a group of leaders to discuss their potential peace plan. But he does say, which is quite important, that whether that will succeed or not is going to depend on the discussion that will be held. So yeah, that's just following on from, I guess, what we've heard previously about Ramaphosa.
Yeah, so South Africa, historically close to Russia and seemingly not stepping away from that position. There have been recent joint military drills with Russia and China, and there's these suggestions that arms and ammunition are being allegedly sent via South Africa to Russia. It would be interesting to see what this trip involves, and of course, Putin has been sanctioned by the International Criminal Court. If he goes to the meeting in South Africa, then they should, by rights, arrest him. There's now talk that actually Putin will attend by video link to get around that. But no, South Africa, an interesting one. We do touch base there every now and again. We've got to keep our eye on that and the impact, the diplomatic clout that Russia has around the rest of the world. Particularly thinking about the UN General Assembly, where every nation gets one vote. There's very different experiences of this war and what it means elsewhere around the world in much of what's called the Global South or Latin America, South America, etc., etc. So, yeah, we do need to keep tabs on Russian diplomatic activity as far as South Africa is concerned. Yesterday, it was a busy day yesterday, so I didn't have time to bring everyone up to date on the latest announcement about arms gifting from Germany. So the new German military aid package for Ukraine, this is the biggest one yet. This was announced late last week when President Zelensky was on his whirlwind European tour and stopped off in Germany. So the biggest one yet from Germany, €2.7 billion. And on Saturday, German Defence Minister Boris Pistorius said that Berlin wanted to show, quote, that Germany is serious in its support for Ukraine. Germany will provide all the help it can as long as it takes. I mean, fairly punchy comments there from Mr. Pistorius. He's traditionally been a bit more hard over with his comments than Gerhard Schroeder. Hang on, I'm having a right old brain moment. Anyway, the bloke who runs Germany. But the package from Germany is going to be 4 more RST. So these are air defence systems. They are RST, infrared imaging system, dash tail thrust vector controlled, i.e. it's an infrared imager that can see the target, and it has tail thrust, so the thrust out the back of the missile can be angled to give the thing better agility. And the SLM bit stands for surface launched medium range. So these are mobile vehicle mounted air defence systems. They are very good. So 4 more of those for Ukraine. I don't know why I say Gerhard Schroeder, for God's sake. Anyway, if we take one system to mean one battery, what do we think we're looking at here? So a bit like the Patriots, one RST SLM battery consists of 3 truck-mounted launchers, each of those launchers having 8 missiles, 40k, 25-mile range for each of those missiles, and then a separate command vehicle that can be positioned up to 20 k's away. So the command vehicle will integrate multiple radar sources, and it can track and launch it can launch all 24 missiles simultaneously. So the RST is a very good air defence system that's being gifted. Germany is also sending 20 Marder infantry fighting vehicles, old but good. Nothing wrong with being old but good. Another 30 Leopard 1A5 variants here. 18 155 howitzers, more Gepard self-propelled anti-aircraft guns. These are basically a Leopard hull with 2 25mm cannons on the side that just have a phenomenal rate of fire and just chuck huge, big old shells in the sky and knock the missiles or the drones out that way. They've had a real reprieve, actually, Gepard. They're very old. It's an old bit of kit, but funny old thing, it works, and they've been brought back basically by through the gifting program for Ukraine. Elsewhere, Germany also another 100 armoured vehicles, another 100 support vehicles, loads of shells, ammunition, and 200 surveillance drones. So after an initial slow start providing military aid to Kyiv, Germany is now one of the biggest supplier of arms to Ukraine, and crucially had the power of veto over the Leopard tanks. So they've said yes, and now other countries that have Leopard can send them in to Ukraine. I'm still trying to think about the German bloke. Who's the guy in charge? Bald fella, that one. Anyway, right. Heathcliff, any last thoughts before we say goodbye?
Well, I've just been I've been asked to write a newsletter, and I've just to say again that I'm just so impressed by the Ukrainians. I mean, I'm not just looking for it all with rose-tinted glasses. There have been times when I've been not incredibly, but I am at times pessimistic and think this is a lot tougher than we realise. But just how resilient the people are and how they've managed to deal with this day in, day out. And I'm just amazed at how impressive they are, and what a wonderful country it is. Really, I've not really much else to add. And then the next few days, I'll be heading off just to look at some charity work that's going on. But yeah, it's just such a privilege to be working here. Really, I really do feel that way about covering this story.
Well, thanks, Heathcliff, and thanks, Maidna, and thanks, Anne. Olaf Scholz. Of course it's Olaf Scholz. What was I thinking? Last week, I sat down with James Cowan, a former Major General in the British Army and now Chief Exec of the Halo Trust, the demining charity. I asked him about Halo Trust laydown across the world, working in difficult circumstances and having to work with some pretty odd bedfellows like the Taliban, and how the charity has had to adjust its work in the face of the full-scale invasion in Ukraine. James Cowan, thank you for joining Ukraine the Latest. You helped plan the Kosovo operation in 1999 and planned the Olympic security model in 2012. You've been Halo's CEO since 2015. I wonder if you could just briefly set out for us the work Halo Trust does, locations, and quite where the world is in the use of and the legal context around landmines.
Well, thank you, Dom. As you say, I've been running the Halo Trust since 2015, and the world has changed a lot since that time. Halo came into being in 1988 in Afghanistan, and it was brought into being to help clear landmines. And it's the largest, what's called mine action NGO in the world. But it has grown and changed a lot since I started in 2015. From a time when we were in 16 countries with about 6,500 staff, we're now in 30 countries with nearly 13,000 staff. And our biggest country remains Afghanistan. Actually, we still have 2,500 people there. We've managed to survive the arrival of the Taliban, and we continue to execute our humanitarian duties there. But we are now in a great and large range of other countries that are affected by conflict. So our world divides between those in conflict and those post-conflict. The post-conflict countries are relatively straightforward. Places like Angola, Sri Lanka, Zimbabwe, Cambodia, Laos. These are countries where landmines were used on a truly gigantic scale. And our work there is to essentially decontaminate the land and restore it to safe farming and other livelihoods. And we can get on with that. And the purity of our work is that there will be a time when those countries are completely landmine free. We've already got Mozambique to the point where there are no more landmines. But in these new countries, which are in conflict, the Halo Trust has changed. And we are evolving from being what you might call a mine action NGO into what I would call a conflict action NGO, because we now not only clear landmines, we clear IEDs. We put a lot of work into our IED clearance techniques, and we are doing that all across Afghanistan at the moment in places that were previously, ironically, unreachable. We can now get into all of Helmand, all the areas around Kandahar, and we have a very considerable amount of growth in those areas. But we're in other countries like Libya, we're in Syria, we're in Iraq, we're in Yemen, we're in Somalia. And these countries are very difficult to operate in, but nevertheless, we need to be there. And our work is not just about landmine and IED clearance, it's about the removal of all sorts of explosive contamination, the control of small arms, armed violence reduction, ammunition stockpile management. And the reason why people like our work is because it has not only a humanitarian benefit, but it has a stabilization benefit. For instance, the British Foreign Office, we work to the Mines and Migration Department. So there's a connection there between addressing conflict and instability and the current migration crisis. So different countries want different things from us. The United States is very keen on stabilization. Norway is very keen on humanitarian support. The Netherlands is very keen on development support. So different requirements, but they're all united in a common purpose. So that's what we're doing, which brings us to Ukraine. And maybe I should pause there before we go on to, I know, the subject you want to talk about this morning, namely Ukraine.
Just before we move to Ukraine, could you say a little bit about working in challenging circumstances and places where you work, if not alongside, I'm thinking Afghanistan, alongside the Taliban, but with the powers that be in the areas you're working in? How is Halo able to function and not be seen as a tool of the West, for example?
So I think the very important aspect of landmine clearance is it is a universally recognised good. And people want to see these devices gone. And the Taliban is no exception to that. People have criticisms to make of the Taliban, but they have achieved stability. And it is now possible to transit all parts of Afghanistan in safety. And they are very committed to the removal of the residual landmine and IED threat, and indeed the remaining NATO munition stockpiles. So they've given us permission to work really across the country. And I found myself in the strange position of being the former commander of Task Force Helmand. Yet I went out last June and had high-level meetings with the Taliban. I met one minister who had been in Guantanamo Bay, another minister who was the brother of Mullah Omar, and I met the commander, effectively, of the Taliban military, the governor of Kandahar. And, these are men who might have had good reason not to like someone like me. But I think what I liked was that they were pragmatists and that they appeared to want to do right by their country. And they could see that the Halo was there not as a political campaigning charity, but as a charity that gets on and does its work without a political bias. So I think that is the reason why we can do this work. And ultimately, we're not there for us, we're not there for the Taliban, we're there for the people of Afghanistan, the women and children and innocent civilians who are killed by these devices.
I'll move to Ukraine now. I think you've been there for 7 years. Can you tell us about your work there, your laydown across the country, and how Halo is able to continue work and the areas you are in since the launch of the full-scale invasion last year?
Yep. So the Halo Trust set up its program in Ukraine in 2015. In other words, a few months after the end of the 2014 conflict. And we were working down in the Donbass. We had about 430 staff from the south in Mariupol up to the north just south of Kyiv. Our centre of operations was around Kramatorsk, i.e. just to the west of the present fighting around Bakhmut. And we were essentially clearing up the landmines and other unexploded ordnance of the 2014 war. When it became apparent that the invasion was looming, my view was that the Russians would likely succeed and that we should put the program on ice and prepare effectively for Ukraine to be overrun. Thankfully, I was wrong, and quite quickly we were able to see that Ukraine was going to survive, and we were able to reconstitute the program. We did have some members of our staff overrun in Mariupol, and others were trapped behind Russian lines in more rural areas of the Donbass. But we were able to pull back and essentially have a rally point at Vinnytsia. And of the original 430 staff, we were able to recover some 200. Some, of course, also of our men of fighting age have been mobilized into the Ukrainian army. But from that low point of around 200, we then rebuilt the program around Kyiv this time, so not in the Donbass. And we've now, through the excellent support we've had from international donors, rebuilt the program to 700 staff. And we have plans to grow to 1,200 staff. We are now operating not just around Kyiv, but Chernihiv, Sumy, Kharkiv, and Mykolaiv. And we are essentially envisioning an operation that will grow in accordance with the Ukrainian capacity to liberate areas. So the way to think about this is less about sort of Berlin 1945, i.e. waiting until the moment of the end of the war. Think of it less like that than perhaps Italy 1943, in which a country is gradually liberated. And as each new area falls into Ukrainian hands, so we will be able to follow up to clear it. And there is a huge task ahead, of which I can elaborate in a minute.
Thank you. So yes, let's talk about that. Has the technology changed, or rather, I presume technology must change? You're probably seeing some very old legacy equipment, but as you say, IEDs is, as the nature of the expression, it's improvised. So how do you stay on top of advances and changes in technology, and where do you see that moving in Ukraine?
So I think, perhaps the most startling aspect of this war is just how little innovation there is. This is a highly conventional war in which the wholesale use of traditional landmines is being made. The Russians are utilizing large stockpiles of conventional landmines and both anti-tank and anti-personnel. The other aspect of this war is, of course, it isn't just about landmine clearance. There are different calculations, but current estimates suggest about 26,000 rounds of artillery ammunition being fired a day. It has been as high as 60,000 rounds, and we all know about current Russian ammunition shortages around Bakhmut and the complaints made by Prigozhin to that effect. But if you average it out, the Russians are firing around 26,000 rounds a day. Ukrainians far lower numbers. The important point here is that with poor industrial standards, about 10% of the Russian ammunition is not detonating. So what we're seeing is the widespread use of dumb artillery ammunition falling into prime agricultural land and needing clearance. So the technology we're seeing is not especially sophisticated. It's just the widespread use of dumb landmines, whether anti-tank or anti-personnel, and dumb artillery ammunition. There is some very, very occasional use of improvised devices, but these are not wholly homemade. These are essentially rigging up factory-produced munition types and creating booby traps with trip devices between trees or indoors in buildings. But this is not a large aspect of this conflict. The thing to bear in mind is the sheer scale of entrenchment, wiring, and landmine laying currently being conducted by the Russians. They are anticipating, obviously, the Ukrainian counteroffensive. With the exception of Bakhmut and various other small areas, they've gone on to the defensive, and they are entrenching and laying landmines on a gigantic scale, a scale not seen in any previous Halo operation. We work on the basis of 1 day's fighting equaling 1 month's clearance. I'm not sure that rule of thumb really holds good in this circumstance, but it does give you some sense of how long this is going to take to clear. And what's absolutely vital here is the amount of land, prime agricultural land, that is currently denied to Ukraine. There is a huge need to get that land back into economic productive use. And so the technology we're employing is moving from hands and knees humanitarian demining by human deminers into the wholesale investment in mechanized capacity to ensure that we can clear prime agricultural land as quickly as possible.
And the Russian operation, as you say, which I presume must be the biggest mining operation in Europe since the Second World War. I can't think it's anything like the scale of the Balkans wars. It must be eclipsed in Ukraine. Are they doing it professionally? Are they marking maps? Are they sharing that information with you? Do you speak to Russians at all? Russian forces, the Wagner Group at all? Any other private military companies? Is there any interaction at all, such you know where these things are being laid?
Well, you asked earlier, and I didn't really answer the question, but let me take the legal basis for this. So the legal basis for the use of landmines is set out within the Ottawa Landmine Ban Convention. And sadly, Russia is not a signatory to that treaty. That Landmine Ban Convention, in any case, only bans anti-personnel mines, not anti-tank mines. So Russia isn't a signatory to it. Ukraine is a signatory, and it is abiding by the anti-personnel landmine ban, but it is allowed to have anti-tank mines. Under the terms of the Geneva Convention, they are required, both sides, to map minefields, to mark them visually, and to share that information. But we are not in receipt of such information from the Russians, and given the present nature of the conflict, I don't expect to be. So one of the vital roles that the Halo Trust plays is survey. What we have to our advantage is this is really the first open source war ever fought, and we're in a position to use social media data to identify community awareness of minefields, and that has provided us with an extraordinary level of detail that we've never previously had. But it has a flaw. It requires the community still to be present. And, of course, in many of the most contested areas of the Donbass, communities have fled and these lands have become very depopulated. So the community reporting of mines is not as good as it should be in and along the Donbass. However, it is excellent around Kyiv. The second way of conducting the survey is through open source satellite data, and we are beginning to build a pretty clear picture of the extent of the Russian minefield defences. There are other resources available to us. The use of artillery, particularly once the land dries out, tends to cause an immediate fire, and the same satellite technology that allows, for instance, US park authorities to monitor summer fires in areas of California and the like can be used immediately to identify fires caused by artillery ammunition. So we're using all this data to map out the level of contamination, and we believe that this is a scale of contamination that dwarfs anything we have seen in Afghanistan or in Cambodia or in Angola. It will be truly a generational task to complete the clearance of Ukraine.
So not seen since Second World War, I presume. Globally, I'm trying to think of another conflict on this scale, not the Iran-Iraq War.
So the big unresolved landmine problems are obviously the DMZ between North and South Korea, and the Iran-Iraq border still has massive numbers of landmines. The border between Thailand and Cambodia was mined extensively by the Vietnamese and by the Khmer Rouge, and that's still a huge landmine barrier. So there are big landmine barriers out there. Even the Rhodesian one on the border with Mozambique is still extant in Zimbabwe and is being cleared. But none of these come anything like the scale of what we're seeing in Ukraine.
And does Halo Trust ever feel itself under pressure from governments to help? I mean, you say you're surveying through various means where these landmines are being laid. I'm sure the Ukrainian government and Western nations are also looking at that. But even if they've got information themselves, they would always look to check that information. Do you find yourself being asked for favours or information, and does that put you in a difficult political position?
So our humanitarian duty is to share and to be transparent. So if we're asked for data which we believe has humanitarian value, we will share it with the United Nations. We've not been asked by the Ukrainians for that information. I think they're perfectly capable of identifying it for themselves. But we, under the terms of the Landmine Ban Treaty, work to the Ukrainian Sovereign Authority. They have a national authority. Every country that is a signatory to the treaty has a national mine action authority, and we don't operate in isolation from their sovereign needs. We work to their clearance plan. So we're perfectly content with that, and that is exactly how it should be under international law.
And just moving towards the end now, if I may, how do you keep going? How do you and your staff keep going? It must be exhausting work. It's emotionally draining. You have lost people. It must be very easy to take a jaundiced view of humanity. How on earth do you keep the operation going?
Well, Dom, thank you for asking. I mean, because I've given you a very sort of dry, sort of retired general analysis of it, but this is a very human business. And we have hundreds of employees who are themselves victims of this war. Some of them have been moved out of their houses back in 2014 and then lost their second house for the second time, in 2020, in February last year. And, they have grandparents who are stuck on the wrong side of the line of control. They have brothers or sons or fathers who've been mobilized or killed or wounded. And every day they're going out to do this incredible work. And if they don't do it, no Ukrainian is going home. No Ukrainian is opening a shop or starting a factory again. And no Ukrainian farmer is plowing a field. So they know what's needed. This is a country incredibly determined to succeed. And we're very lucky to have these very brave men and women who come and do this work. By the way, people think of mine action as a very male world, but actually we're increasingly employing women because they are just very immaculate workers. They know how to do the drills well and they don't make mistakes. And moreover, of course, they're not subject to mobilization into the army. So we're very proud of the number of women that we employ in the Halo Trust in Ukraine and worldwide.
And you had an all-female team in Afghanistan, I understand. And what's happened to that team?
So we've never had an all-female team in Afghanistan. What we have always had is mixed teams that go out to do survey, and they do it in accordance with Sharia law, working with either a husband, a father, or a brother. And that was before the Taliban coming to power. What we're actually in negotiation with the Taliban is to allow us to employ more women in Afghanistan. We are obviously going very carefully about this. We want to be respectful of local customs, but we are not a campaigning charity. We're not there to poke people in the chest. And we will do this with patience and at a pace that takes account of local sensibility. But in other countries, in Angola, for instance, we started out with a program called 100 Women in Demining. Well, it's a misnomer now. We've now got 800 women in demining in Angola. So it's we're achieving huge success with our employment of women, and they are very disproportionately the beneficiaries of this work, because they can very often, if they're single family heads of households, be on the breadline as women on their own. But with jobs from us, we can give them not only a job as a deminer, but then the land is cleared and they have a sustainable livelihood as a small-scale farmer long into the future.
And finally, are you sufficiently resourced? I mean, how do you raise your funds? How are you able to keep going as an organisation?
So the Halo Trust is funded by a range of international donors, mostly Western countries. The United States is our largest donor, the United Kingdom, European countries, European Union. But we are also the beneficiaries of some very significant private donors. And of course, the Ukraine war has galvanized support for us, both from private foundations, from large corporates, and from high net worths. Many of these people do this without any desire for glory. We have one anonymous donor in the United States who is paying for the clearance of 2 whole countries, and he doesn't want any publicity. It's pretty amazing what people are willing to do, because they recognize that, if a land cannot be cleared of mines, then it cannot be normal. And people are hurt, people are killed, people are wounded, and people live in poverty. So that's the purpose of our work, and people increasingly recognize that. We're not a massively well-known charity. People have heard about us, but we are always on the look for new donors, new supporters who can recognize the value of what we do.
And I think you touched on it earlier on, but just to finish, if the fighting stopped tomorrow, how long would it take to clear Ukraine?
This is a very difficult question, because you're asking me what's the score when we may not even have got to the half time of the match. And so, but if it did stop tomorrow, and it's been going now for 14, 15 months, I have a rule of thumb, which is 1 day of fighting equals 1 month of clearance. We're into many decades to get this job done. And the only way we can advance that is by raising more money and by growing substantially the number of people and the amount of mechanical equipment we have to clear Ukraine of this contamination.
James Cowan, thanks so much for talking to Ukraine the Latest.
Thank you, Dom. Thank you.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to podcast apps. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can always get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. You can also contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear. And today on Twitter, Emily Hill.